Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
I'm Serena Halstead.
And I am Melissa Smith, and welcome to our Data Lit podcast. This is our two-part series on feedback. And in the first part of the series, we explored 4 topics. What is feedback? Why give feedback? Who gives feedback? And how to give feedback. And in the second part, we will explore different perspectives of feedback, starting with today's episode, a teacher's perspective on feedback and the feedback culture. So to help us with this topic, we have 2 guest teachers, 8th grade teachers. We have Bill Ferriter and Paul Cancellieri, both 8th grade science teachers from Wake County Public Schools. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I didn't write up a really neat bio on you guys. So, I could have, gone sneaking on your Facebook pages and see, but Bill,
You
Paul.
didn't do any cyber stalking?
I did not.
That's shame.
I resisted the urge of Google searching and seeing. Bill, Paul, do you want to introduce yourselves as a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. My name is Bill Ferriter. I am an 8th grade science teacher. That's my claim to fame. I've been teaching this is my 28th year, all in Wake County Public Schools. And so I think that's what I'm proudest of, is that I'm a real practitioner. And I think that has some authority and some credibility. So, Paul, what about you?
Yeah, my story is very similar. I have spent 20 years teaching 8th grade science and a little bit of 6th and 7th grade science, all of it here in Wake County. I was a scientist before I came into teaching, so I was a lateral entry teacher, and I think that does inform a little bit of what I do. But like Bill, I think that being in the classroom every day is the thing I'm proudest of.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. So I think what you share, again, what we've tried to do with our podcast is, again, share our teacher experiences. So I think your addition to this episode will add to that. So I'll get us started. So I'm interested in the question of a culture of feedback. So in all of the things that we've discussed so far in the first part of the series, we sort of hinted at the culture of feedback and how you create that. And so how can we embed this idea of useful feedback into the DNA of our schools and our districts?
Paul, you want to give that a crack first?
Yeah, I think that it starts with the students. It has to be sort of a grassroots thing. The kids have to believe that feedback has value to them. So many of them already feel like grades as a measurement don't really help them at all. They don't see the value of grades. They see them used as a weapon against them more often than not. And so I think we start with the students in an idea where they're given opportunities to do work, they're given feedback, and then encouraged and instructed on how to use that feedback to improve their work. And then they see that improvement is then counted. It's used as an improvement of their grade, and they start to understand that feedback that they get from teachers and from one another and from themselves helps them to do better, and that has value in and of itself.
It's a powerful answer coming from Paul, too, because whether your listeners know or not, Paul is running a gradeless classroom. And so that whole, as an 8th grade teacher. And so, you have to imagine how difficult it is to convince 8th graders who have spent years playing the traditional game of school, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I turn in work, you give it a grade, you hand it back, and we all move on, right? Like to convince 8th graders that feedback is more important than grades is a challenge, simply because they've learned the game of school. And Paul said something important there that I want to point out to your listeners too. He said that a part of the work that we would have to do if we really wanted to shift from a culture of grading to a culture of feedback in schools is convincing people that feedback has value too. And that means convincing students, convincing parents, convincing our peers, convincing our principals. Like feedback just really has been pushed to the side in the interest of chasing points. Yeah. And unless we can convince people of the value in feedback, I don't know that we're ever going to change the culture of schools. It's a big shift. Let's just put it that way.
I'm going to veer a little bit. So, Paul, I'm curious, how did you convince parents? Because I think that sounds like the biggest stumbling block.
So you're right. That was the biggest stumbling block. My administrator was on board from the get-go, and the kids didn't take much convincing to recognize the value. It was the parents who are used to getting a certain amount of information from the grade and just assumed that it had to be that way. And so the way we sort of soothed their fears was by making it clear that that their student is still going to end every quarter with a grade, because that's the system we live in and it has to be that way. But that the way they get that grade is going to be much more driven by the student and their ability to capture evidence of their learning and then use that evidence to kind of arrive at a grade. So it's really much more of a conversation between the kids and the teacher. And honestly, we had to get through a quarter of doing it and answering a lot of questions from parents before the parents started to believe in it. But once they see it working, some of the parents see it as no big change. From their perspective, their kid who got A's and B's is still getting A's and B's. They don't see what's going on under the surface, I think, which is a real sea change in the way that that the kids think about what they're doing. And then some parents saw the benefits because their kids actually get better grades because their kids have more ways and more opportunities to show their learning. And as a result, the kids who may not have been good at your stereotypical tests are now showing the learning that they're doing in a way that they couldn't before.
It's so important. You said that it took about a month for your teachers, your parents to become convinced that this was legit. I see the same thing in my students when I try to integrate elements of constructive feedback into my classroom and try to prioritize that over grades. It does take a while to convince my students that I'm telling the truth, that feedback is just as valuable as grades are. They don't oftentimes believe that, and that's just because of how they've always learned before.
Right.
I think that's really discouraging. To me, that's evidence of what we've done to students, right? Like we've decreased or devalued feedback and learning, and we've prioritized chasing points. That's why you get kids like, and the minute we give an assignment in class, what does the student say? Right? As an 8th grade teacher in a traditional school, is this going to be graded? That's the first thing they ask. It's the first thing they do. Pass back a paper to students, right? The answer is they look at their score. Then what's the second thing they do? They leave it on their table and walk out of the room and go to the next class. It doesn't even matter what the task is. And so to me, that's what's kind of so disheartening about the traditional culture of school, is that we've prioritized grades over learning, and kids have learned that lesson well.
Right.
And that makes me sad.
And it's interesting too, because feedback comes natural to us as humans, but grades does not. They're like from our earliest times, like Homo sapiens, the idea is that we rely and we operate on feedback. Like what happens if I eat this berry, that kind of stuff. There's no grades attached. The grade is the artificial piece that we built into that kind of culture. So it's just, how do we kind of take back that natural progress of feedback without, going back to what Hattie says, that label attached, because it's that label level where it becomes problematic and detrimental for a lot of our kids.
Yeah.
I think it takes real quickly, Serena, it takes a little bit of courage, because we're fighting against a system that, from the teacher's perspective, is often built upon us. Every week I hear somebody say, well, but they have to be ready for high school, and high school is not like that. And then high school teachers say, well, they have to be ready for college, and college is not like that. At some point, somebody has to draw a line in the sand and say, well, I'm not going to prepare them for bad education, right? I'm not going to prepare them for a situation that's not going to make them better at what they're trying to do.
It's not my job to prepare kids for high school. As a middle school teacher, I'm going to go on the record. It's not my job to prepare kids for high school. It's my job to make sure that students feel like they are capable and competent learners. It's my job to give kids chances to demonstrate mastery. It's my job to figure out what the needs of an individual student are and to address those needs and move them forward. But preparing them for the traditional structures of high school doesn't fall within my job description. Super sorry, high school teachers. So. Super sorry.
You're gonna lose all listeners. We're like, done
with that guy.
So Paul and William, I am convinced about it takes some time to convince them that, feedback is important. And I'm relating it back to an experience that I have most recently. So I am studying and I am getting, grades from different lecturers, right? And one of the things I noticed with this most recent lecturer, he not only gives a grade, but he also gives the feedback. Now, when I go to see my score at the end of the week, I'm just looking for the grade. And I notice that my grades are kind of like dwindling. And I'm like, But then I notice that he gives feedback. And it's not just, oh, well done, like typically what I normally get. He goes off by giving me what you did well and how you can improve. Even when he gives me, for example, 100%, he goes to say what you could improve. And I find myself no longer looking for the grade anymore. I'm wanting to see what he thinks I should improve. It's interesting that, okay, so I have 100. Oh, what are you going to tell me now? But that's like the only thing I'm now looking for. I just want to see the feedback that he has for me. So I think, as you mentioned, the feedback, it's going to take some time to convince, but that's very interesting because I'm being convinced now, looking just for the feedback, not the grades anymore.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I would say that your professor, he's kind of taken a cue from John Bon Jovi. He's about halfway there. I like that he's giving you ways to improve, and that is a characteristic of effective feedback. Bob Marzano has talked often about the fact that effective feedback is both timely and directive, right? So we've got to be specific enough in the feedback that we give to students that they can act on it. I also like that the sounds of your professor is that he's not overwhelming you with feedback. Sometimes the mistake that teachers make is we feel like we need to correct every single mistake that a student makes in order for them to address all those mistakes. Right. But what that really does is paralyze learners because they get all of this negative feedback or all of these areas to improve, and they don't know where to begin. They are frozen with the amount of feedback that they're given. Now, here's what your professor can improve on. Dylan Williams says that the best feedback feels like detective work to students. And so what we really need to be doing isn't just giving feedback to learners, but asking them to gather feedback about their own progress towards mastery. So you heard Paul mention that a couple of times, giving kids opportunities to document what they're doing and to use that evidence as proof of mastery is really the gold standard of feedback. Like asking students to identify strengths and weaknesses in their own work and then act on that evidence is when we really get to the point where feedback becomes powerful. So he's about halfway there. It's better than just giving you a grade. But he's got work to do too.
Yeah, I like that. So I have a question here for both of you. How has the increase in blended and online learning influenced your views and feedback?
Paul?
Well, I would say it's reinforced them more than anything else. I was already using Google Classroom and the ability to give feedback within digital documents there. That was already part of my practice before we started becoming remote, and I've embraced it. I've started using audio feedback using a plugin in Google Chrome called Mote, M-O-T-E, that is really fantastic. And I tie that with what Bill just said. I give feedback that tells the kids, I saw two really great things in what you did. One of them in this paragraph, one of them in this paragraph. I'd really like you to find what those things are. Or I'll say things like, there are 3 things that you missed in this section. If you look carefully, I think you can figure out what they were, so that the kids then feel invited to this almost this game of let's find what I can improve. But, at the same time, the verbal feedback offers that more personalized, like this is a message just for you about what you did well and what you could do better. And I find that to be really powerful. And that's something that I can do digitally and online or blended much easier than I could do it in person.
I got two things to add on to that. First of all, I hope you heard the strategy that Paul just mentioned, right? Because it's specific and it's simple, right? Instead of pointing out to students, here is your mistake, right? Saying to students, I think you've got a couple of mistakes in this particular paragraph, or you've missed 2 of these 5 questions. Can you find which ones they are? That's turning feedback into detective work. It's asking students to be on the lookout for their levels of mastery. And then in response,
students as well, right? So that's part of that student involvement, student.
Yeah, 100%. And then to respond to you, Serena, an additional thought is that during remote and blended learning, opportunities for student self-assessment and self-directed feedback are far more important than ever before, because students have been removed from the environment of school, where there is lots of tacit feedback around them all the time. When a student is in a classroom in a physical space and a different child asks a question and gets an answer from the teacher, that's feedback to the learner as well. Even the kid who's just sitting and listening is receiving feedback about, did I understand this concept or not? If you think about when a group of kids are sitting at a table with one another and they're working on problems with each other, a student can turn to a partner and really quickly get some feedback on whether or not he's headed in the right direction. Even if they don't talk to each other, even if a student just glances over and sees what another child is doing, that's tacit feedback from the environment. And those things are all gone right now, right? Like my daughter learns in that empty classroom right next door to me all day long. And I check in on her, like I go and look in between my own classes to see how she's doing. But that's it. It's just her by herself trying to figure out what's going well and what's not going well. The feedback from the environment has been removed completely, which means that we need to give kids more opportunities to assess their own progress towards mastery.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that's one thing. So Bill and Paul actually wrote a book on this topic, creating a culture of feedback. Some of you guys wrote that I thought was really interesting. The best feedback progressions begin long before students complete any work, as teachers help them identify outcomes worth mastering. Can you guys speak to a little bit of how this works in general and particularly in blended or online settings?
Yeah. So it starts with them sort of decoding the standards that the state has determined, they need to learn in a particular area. So in a normal year, a non-blended learning year, we would actually use some strategies and tools to break down those standards into student-friendly statements that they can understand. Because you can't figure out if you've reached a target if you don't understand what that target is.
All right.
So we need to make those really clear. In my classroom, that process has modified a little bit because in this current blended environment, we simply can't cover all the standards the way we could before, at least not to a level of mastery that I consider, acceptable. So what I've started encouraging my students to be a part of is we actually handpick the standards that we're going to focus on. So I show them all the ones that we're supposed to do. I help them to translate them into student-friendly language. And then I say, looking at this list, what does your gut tell you is important here? And then through guided conversations, we handpick the standards that we're going to spend the most time on. And then they feel that sense of ownership that what we're doing, the road we're on, is a road that they helped choose.
I think that's my one concern about whether we can make a culture of feedback the norm in schools. Because everything that Paul just described right now is infinitely doable. Yeah. And it's incredibly appropriate. It leads to higher levels of engagement by students because they have some ownership over the learning that they're doing. They have a better sense of the why behind what they're doing. But I promise you that one of your listeners out there right now is going, yeah, tell that to my principal who wants me to teach the entire curriculum, whether we're in a pandemic or not.
Correct.
See, there's always a bit of moral tension in the work that teachers do between what we know is the right thing to do and what we're being told to do by the system. Right. And so I think for structural changes to happen across the entire system, for a culture of feedback to become the norm in a building or in a district, I think we're going to need to see the powers that be, people who have organizational power, push for practices like the one that Paul is describing. Otherwise, we'll see pockets of change. Innovative teachers like Paul and Bill will revise their practice because they're willing to take that professional risk, and they'll use books like Creating a Culture of Feedback to find ways to successfully alter their practice. But systemic change is dependent on something more than a couple of innovative teachers who are doing things different in their own rooms.
So I would say then it's not just the teachers, because, whatever the teachers they do, it's driven by leadership. So for all of this change to take place, it has to start with leadership, right? So the leadership is more or less pushing. If leadership is pushing for it, if a teacher knows that the principal is coming in to hear how she provides feedback to her students, then that's an expectation in behavior, and it has to start with the leaders.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a little chicken and egg kind of thing, because we see people like you guys really doing incredible work and working with the students. I think it can't just be bottom up. just isolated classrooms, but also can't just be top down where we're not actually communicating why this benefits the students and the families. It's got to be a merge of the two. And hopefully by people listening to this conversation, that encourages them to have conversations. Teachers with their students looking at bottom up, but also teachers with their administrators or people in central office to think about, are there different ways that we can think about incorporating real, actionable, specific, timely feedback as the emphasis as opposed to just labels?
I agree with the idea that it has to be a partnership, top down and bottom up. I think Bill and I both work in buildings where we have supportive leadership. You know, my whole gradeless movement started with my principal turning to me and saying, is this something you'd want to take on? And without his invitation, I don't think I would have had the courage or the gusto to make it happen because I knew it would be an uphill battle. And I know that many principals feel intimidated by those standards, but this is a year of courage in a lot of ways for me, because I look at the EOGs, like we have an 8th grade science EOG, and there is literally no way that my students are going to perform as well on that EOG this year as my other students have in the past. And acknowledging that is a completely unrealistic goal does give me a little freedom to try things I may not have tried in the past, because I'd rather set my own goals at this point.
And I feel like I'm a year and a half from retirement. So I can experiment with everything, because I think it takes longer than a year and a half to terminate a teacher, right? So but what I want you to hear in that comment is a teacher shouldn't have to feel like they're taking a risk when they're integrating responsible practice into their instruction. Grant Wiggins says that grades are utterly useless as a form of actionable feedback. And we all know that, right? Like, students can't act with anything with just a number. Like, there's not an ability to change the direction of your learning if all you're getting as a form of feedback is a number. We know that to begin with. John Hattie has shown in his research that student self-assessment, the ability for a student to be able to say, where am I going and how far have I gotten towards that final goal? And if I haven't made it very far, how do I close the gap? Like, that ability to take action, it's the highest leverage instructional practice we have in schools.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing that we do pedagogically results in higher levels of achievement. However, it's still a risk to be able to say, I'm not concerned about the end of grade test scores because whatever, there's nothing that I can do about it. It's just not the reality for a lot of teachers in a lot of schools, where principals expect those scores to fall within a certain range. And that's why I think I'm super worried about the ability to see a culture of feedback become systemic if we're going to just rely on it being a bottom-up initiative, because it involves too many teachers having to take too many professional risks that they're not all ready and or able to take.
So you guys have offered us a lot to think about. And so, like, whenever I go to any kind of professional learning, one of the things I like to leave with is, if a teacher listening to this was inspired, I was like, oh, I want to do something different, what would be one thing that you would recommend they do to begin this journey of shifting from a culture of grading to a culture of feedback?
You know, I really rarely ever plug my book. And I said my book, and it's actually our book. Paul and I wrote a fantastic book called Creating a Culture of Feedback. And I hate plugging it because it feels dirty, right? Like, teachers don't want to say, hey, I discovered something that works really well. Here it is, and I'm going to sell it. Right. For some reason, that's another cultural norm that we have established in schools, that it's not okay for teachers to sell their ideas. However, you said, what one thing do I think teachers should do? And I would argue, pick up the book, Creating a Culture of Feedback. I mean, it's about 80 pages long, and it's full of practical suggestions and strategies. And I think what will happen for teachers who read the book is they'll say, oh, these strategies aren't intimidating at all. Right. I think sometimes when we say, let's reimagine the culture of schools, teachers are like, ain't nobody got time for that.
Right.
But in reality, if you look at the kinds of suggestions and strategies that Paul and I offer, I think you'll see that there are easy entry points for everyone. Paul, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a great idea. I mean, it's a great book, and I'm something I'm very proud of. But I also think that it can start as small as take the next assignment that you were going to give students a grade on, and instead of a grade, give them narrative feedback, either in text form or audio form.
Yeah.
Give them feedback and a chance to fix their work, and just see how that changes the mindset of even a small number of students right from the get-go. And that hook, that look on the kid's face when they realize that your job is not to be the judge, jury, and executioner, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and help them actually get better, that will pay off dividends for the rest of the year.
What Paul and I have both seen is that as 8th grade teachers, is that by 8th grade, there are a lot of kids who've given up on school completely.
Yeah.
What do they look like? They come into our rooms with their hoods on their hoodies up. They sit down at their table in the back of the room. They'll put their head down on their table and not listen at all for the entire session. Even if we give out a physical assignment in class, those same students may not even complete an assignment that we're doing in class. And some of my peers, and I'm sure it's probably true for Paul too, automatically assume that those kids are lazy or that they're irresponsible or that they just don't care. When Paul and I, our argument is they've given up because they've seen no evidence from schools
that
they're capable and competent learners. So until we leave a kid convinced that they can be a capable and competent learner, then we shouldn't be surprised when they check out in a learning space, because the lessons they've learned from learning spaces are you're not going to be successful. All those D's that you've gotten year after year, or all those 2s in elementary school, that pattern that they see of themselves, they are a D or they are a 2. And so what Paul's recommendation was, that idea of narrative feedback, and I'm not the judge, jury, and executioner, and let's see if we can figure out what you've done wrong and improve on it. What that does is helps to build the confidence of learners. And once they see themselves as confident, they're more likely to lean in.
Yeah, that it creates this virtuous cycle. But when we withhold this measure, it creates a vicious cycle. And I think so Susan Brookhart talks about how she says research provides evidence that teachers often do talk with quote unquote good students as if they were active, self-regulated learners, but often just tell poor students what to do. So one of the things I would really stress is I feel like there's this temptation like, oh, I'll experiment, I'll do that feedback or feed forward, with the honors class, but not with my other classes. But really, it's changing that mindset and empowering all of our students that's going to really start to make a difference. And that's where we're going to see how profound this movement can be.
Well, and Spencer, you said something essential. I mean, God bless the honors class. And if your listeners want to start with the honors class because they're convinced that would be an easy thing for them to do, I'll embrace that simply because I want people to take a step forward.
True.
However, the kids who need to see evidence of mastery are the kids who are in the class that struggles the most. They're the ones that live in a system where they never see evidence of mastery. They may get a D on a pre-test and a D on a post-test. Now, you and I and all your listeners know that every kid learns something in your class during the course of a unit, but there's no way to see evidence of that in a traditional grading system. And so starting with your honors class may be an easy entry point, but those aren't the kids who need to build confidence in their own ability as academic learners. John Hattie calls it building the academic reputation of learners, and every kid deserves to have one. So, and it's our job to help them build that.
I'm just, remembering someone asked me a question once, how more or less like, students are always doing well in the class. And she asked me to say, what is it? Have you ever thought about writing down what are you doing that makes students so successful? And I never stopped to think about it now until I'm actually listening to you both. And I'm sensing something here that you're both great teachers. And I don't even have to come and look at what your students are doing in their test scores. But I'm sensing that what makes you both great is the feedback that you're providing to the students. You're not relying on grades. And it just dawned on me now, What do you do when you teach your students, Serena? You basically come back, you look at how they perform, but you're coming back and you're telling them, you didn't do this well, you did this well, this is how we're going to improve it. Tell me, what else do you need from me? And I'm sensing that that's what's going on with both of you. That it just taps right back to the question that was asked. What make you a good teacher? How is it that your students are doing well?
Paul, answer that.
Behind closed door. It's what you're doing behind that grade. Yeah.
Paul, answer that. What is it that makes you a great teacher?
I think what makes me a great teacher is that if you ask my students, they would tell you that I am their partner in success, that I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with them, walking the walk with them. And I help them see where we're heading, and I let them take the lead sometimes, and sometimes I take the lead, but we're all in it together, and we're all of us going to make it to the end of this road, whatever that road looks like for them.
And I'm so glad that was your answer, because I was asked this question in a different podcast yesterday. And my answer was, I'm going to do whatever I can to help a kid in my room succeed and to see themselves as successful little learners. Right. So that I think what you see in teachers who perform at the highest levels is that they can leave kids convinced that success is possible. Yeah. And once a kid is convinced that success is possible, they're more likely to lean in and give you their best effort always. So, yeah. And that's what creating a culture of feedback is all about. Like, it's building this notion that you can be successful too.
Yeah.
I wish I was a part of your class when I was a kid.
Yeah, I don't think I get it right all the time, and I bet you Paul would say the same thing. I mean, the scars that I bear are the kids that I know that I failed.
I definitely agree that Bill doesn't get it right all the time.
Thanks for that. Much appreciated.
So I think this brings us to the end of this episode. I want to thank you both again. This has been really exciting, having you both as practitioners joining us as fellow practitioners and talking about the teacher perspective about what it takes to build a culture of feedback. And so thank you again for coming on. Our next episode, we will be looking at the student perspective of feedback. And I think we should share this with you guys, because I think you'll enjoy just to hear what the students have had to say about feedback. I know I have been really impressed about what they had to say. It just surprised me about their comments about feedback. And so we'll share that with you guys. So for more information, don't forget to join us on www.wcpss.net/datalit if you have any questions, comments, or further notes for us. And again, stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See you now.
Bye, guys.